Thank you very much. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20615 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on Scotland's future. I would encourage all members who wish to contribute to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on the First Minister to speak to and to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today I am asking Parliament to endorse a basic but fundamental principle. The principle that Scotland's future should be decided not by politicians at Westminster who haven't won a general election in Scotland since the 1950s, but instead by all of us who live here and call Scotland home. It is the sovereign right of the people of Scotland to determine the form of government best suited to our needs. That is the declaration at the heart of the claim of right, and it should be endorsed by this Parliament today. Now, we'll hear, I'm sure, a lot of faux outrage from opposition parties today about the fact this debate is taking place at all. So let us, at the very outset, remind ourselves exactly why it is. On Friday, because of the Brexit obsession of the Conservative Party, Scotland will be removed from the European Union against our will. In Scotland, the vote to remain in the EU was more than 60%. That desire to stay at the heart of Europe has been reiterated at every election since. And of course, it's not just about the fact of Brexit, it is also about the consequences of it. And make no mistake, those consequences will be significant for our country now and well into the future. There will be consequences for our economy and trade, our public services and the opportunities open to our young people. Some of these consequences are already known to us. For example, the practical and emotional impact on the 200,000 EU nationals who have made such an enormous contribution to our country. And then there's the impact on our population levels in future that will make it so much harder for businesses to recruit the workers they need and for successive Scottish governments to sustain our public services. And other consequences will become clearer as trade negotiations get underway. Yes.
Neil Findlay.
Support independence, that will be no surprise to the First Minister. But had this motion been more realistic and rational, I might have voted for it, because I absolutely believe in the sovereign right of the Scottish people to decide their future. But the First Minister herself has said that we do not know all of the implications of Brexit. We don't. Therefore, it is unrealistic to have any referendum until we know exactly what's happening with Brexit.
First Minister.
Well, look, Neil Findlay, I think, has a more respectable position on this than many of his colleagues. But you either accept Scotland's right to choose our own future or you don't. It's not conditional on what you think that choice should be. And that's the principle at the heart of this debate. But as I was saying, Presiding Officer, other consequences will become clearer as these trade negotiations get underway. And contrary to what we hear, and indeed, as Neil Findlay has said, Brexit is not yet done. But these trade negotiations are about to be led by a UK government that is completely deaf to Scotland's interests, needs and voice. At no point in the past 3.5 years since the Brexit vote has any effort whatsoever been made to understand Scotland's different views or accommodate our interests in any way. Indeed, as recently as Monday, when the Scottish Government published practical proposals on migration, backed by businesses and Civic Scotland, designed to work within the current constitutional arrangements, the response of the UK Government was to dismiss them out of hand with no consideration whatsoever. That's the reality Scotland faces as part of the Westminster system, and it is not good enough. I hope Jackson Carlow will back our migration proposals.
Jackson Carlow.
First Minister, if you were trying to build a genuine consensus in this Parliament around proposals, I thought you might have circulated them or offered them to the leaders of the other political parties. I've still received no such communication from your office. I don't know how you expect us to build some sort of consensus when all you do is grandstand in public and shout about, rather than actually circulating them to this Parliament.
First Minister.
I can share it with Jackson Carlow that the proposals are available on the internet. I'm sure he is able to use a computer. But in the interest of consensus, I will ensure that a copy is personally delivered to Jackson Carlow's office later this afternoon, and then perhaps we can get his support for that, and he can perhaps try to persuade the UK government not to dismiss them out of hand. I wait for that intervention from Jackson Carlaw. But, you know, having our future imposed on us by a UK government that is utterly contemptuous of our views, it isn't good enough. And contemptuous of our interests, and a government more so that seems intent not on preserving a close relationship with the EU, but on the right to diverge and deregulate. And what that means in future for workers' rights, environmental protections, for the shape of our economy and the nature of our society will be profound. And, you know, Labour in particular perhaps should reflect on this. If they continue to stand against the right of the Scottish people to even consider a different future, then it is that Tory vision for Scotland's future that they are giving the green light to. A Tory vision driven on the part of some by jingoism and xenophobia. A Tory vision that will narrow the horizons of the next generation, make the country poorer and hit hardest those who are already poor and vulnerable. If Labour stands aside and lets that come to pass, then it will be on them just as much as on the Conservatives. Presiding Officer, at the heart of all of this is a basic fact. Brexit and everything that will flow from it is happening against the will of the vast majority of the Scottish people. It is an affront to democracy. And of course, it represents a material change of circumstances from those that we faced in the 2014 independence referendum. You know, back then, the message from those on the anti-independence side could not have been clearer. The only way to protect EU membership, they said, was to reject independence. As Ruth Davidson said, and I am quoting her directly, "No means we stay in, we are members of the EU." Of course, they also told us then that the Tories probably wouldn't win the next election and the prospect of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister was just a scare story. And yet now, because we are not independent, we have a Boris Johnson-led majority government that Scotland did not vote for, and we stand just 2 days away from losing our EU membership and all of the rights that go with it. In my view, it is beyond doubt now that the only realistic way for Scotland to return to the heart of Europe and ensure that we get the governments we vote for is to become an independent country. Now, I accept, in a moment, that many, including the member trying to intervene in this chamber and across the country, take a different view of independence. That is entirely legitimate. But what should be beyond any democratic argument in light of the material change of circumstances that Brexit represents is that it must be Scotland's choice to make. And it must be for this Parliament, not Westminster, to determine when and on what basis an independence referendum should take place, a view, of course, backed by more than 60% of people in Scotland in a poll just at the weekend. And on that point, I'm very happy to give way.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank the First Minister for giving way, and it's really appropriate at that point because he's just quoted an opinion poll of 60%. But we did actually have a vote last month, and 55%, the majority of Scottish vote. You might not like this, but this is the fact. 55% of Scottish voters
Order, can we hear the question, please?
Voted for candidates who did not want another referendum. How about recognising a democratic mandate?
The First Minister.
You know at least one Liberal Democrat candidate who stood in that election in Scotland who backed Scottish independence, so I think the argument is somewhat flawed. But of course, let's go on to elections, Presiding Officer. My party has now won 3 successive elections on a manifesto commitment to offer people a choice, not to impose a future on them as the Tories want to do, but to give them a choice between accepting Brexit as part of the Westminster system or choosing a different future as an independent country. In the general election just past, it was the Tories who explicitly recognised that the result would provide a mandate. It was on the ballot paper, they said. A vote for the SNP was a vote for a referendum, and the only way to stop it was to vote Tory. Well, people cast their verdict. In that election, the Tories lost more than half of their seats, and the SNP won a higher share of the vote than Boris Johnson did UK-wide. The democratic case for allowing people in Scotland to decide whether or not to become an independent country is overwhelming. And it is that principle, not the substance of the independence issue, that Parliament has been asked to endorse today. But of course, it is hard to escape the conclusion that it is their fear of the choice Scotland would make on the substantive question that is driving the anti-democratic position of the opposition parties. Parties who had confidence in their case, who believed that it would win the day, would have no problem whatsoever with trusting the people of Scotland to make the choice. It is only ever parties who know that their arguments are bust that have to resort to blocking democracy. The problem for the Tories, Labour and the completely misnamed Liberal Democrats is that the more contempt they show for the right of Scotland to choose their own future, the more they demonstrate the urgent need for us to become independent as the only way to protect our vital interests. Presiding Officer, I can't remember the last time I heard any of these parties make a positive case for the Union. All they ever do is tell us to keep quiet and accept whatever the Tories want to throw at us. For my part, I will make and continue to make the positive case for independence. It is the means by which we can shape our own future and build a better Scotland. With control over tax and social security, we can protect our schools and hospitals from the Tory austerity that has been imposed on us for a decade. We can do more to lift people out of poverty. We can build a fairer country. With control over economic levers and as part of the world's largest trading bloc, we can build a more prosperous country. With control over migration policy, we can end the hostile environment and ensure that we remain the welcoming, tolerant nation we must always be. With independence, we can choose to become a member of the European Union in our own right. Now, as I said earlier, I know not everyone agrees with my position on independence, but I'm happy to have that debate and let Scotland decide. What MSPs across the chamber have to decide today is this: do they support the principle in the claim of right for Scotland, that it is for the Scottish people to determine our future? Do they support the principle that in any democracy people must be entitled to change their minds, particularly when facing a democratic outrage such as being forced out of the EU? Do they support the principle that election results in Scotland matter? Now, I know that the Tories will vote against all of these principles today. But for others in this chamber, consider this. If you support the Tory position today, you're not just voting against the right of the people of Scotland to choose our own future. You will be voting for something too. You'll be voting for the right of the Tories to impose a hard Brexit upon us. You will be voting for a future to be foisted on Scotland that you know will make us poorer in so many ways. You'll be voting to expose our workers' rights and environmental protections to a Tory party threatening a race to the bottom. You'll be voting to give Boris Johnson the right to negotiate over our heads a trade deal with Donald Trump that you know can threaten our NHS. You'll be voting to end freedom of movement, knowing that it will lead to a decline in Scotland's population. Because if you refuse people in Scotland the right to choose a different future, all of these things will happen. Given what the Tories have in store, proposing a further decision on independence isn't simply legitimate, it is necessary. Presiding Officer, it is time to put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. That's why I urge Parliament to back the motion in my name.
Thank you. I call Jackson Carlo to open for the Conservatives.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking the First Minister for fulfilling, really in my experience, a promise made in this Parliament for the very first time. I have just received a copy of her migration proposals, so thank you. I move and speak to the amendment in my name. And let's be upfront about why we are here today. It's not because the First Minister thinks she is going to hold a referendum this year. She knows that's not going to happen. The reason we've been called here today is because she needs to convince the Yes movement behind her and beyond that something is happening. Or that if something isn't actually happening, then don't worry, it'll be happening soon. It points to the real indictment of this government. Divided, fearful to tell hard truths to its own political supporters, so obsessed about mollifying them, in some way that the interests of the people of Scotland get shoved to one side. Well, if the First Minister feels the need to attend marches in her spare time to shore up her position with Joanna Cherry and the diehards, then that's up to her. But I don't see why the majority of the country have to play along with this ridiculous charade. She says there'll be a referendum by Christmas. Really? Well, given the state of the ferry service over which she presides, they'd better start sending the ballot papers to the islands now. There's going to be a new white paper, and we're still to accept, according to the First Minister, that the last one was the most authoritative ever. Breathlessly, her tame polling company claims that people do support a referendum being agreed, and yet somehow forget to ask people whether they actually support independence. If only this government spent the same amount of attention on police and schools as it does on polling and spin, we might have the safest streets and the best schools in Europe. And while the SNP debate amongst themselves their favoured route to another referendum, what the timetable should be, and whether or not the approval of Westminster, most people outside the political bubble just look on in either wearied resignation or abject fury. The debate people outside this chamber want to see is about how to drive up educational standards and give their children the solid start in life they need and deserve. Instead, they get parliamentary statements about more referendums. They want to see action on how to tackle a drugs death crisis that is claiming over 1,000 Scottish lives every year, the highest in Europe. They want to see action to reverse the record low attainment result in Highers and Advanced Highers in Scotland's schools. They want to see the 4-year rise in violent crime stopped, frontline officer numbers protected, and a government which doesn't describe collapsing ceilings in police stations as hyperbole. Instead, civil servants are directed to waste time drawing up more plans for independence. People want a debate over how to grow our economy, create more better paid and secure jobs, to drive up living standards for everyone in Scotland. Instead, here we go again, more time devoted to this First Minister's personal obsession at the expense of the country's real and pressing priorities. You know, perhaps the First Minister really can't let it go. Perhaps she's fated to see out the rest of her days in office single-mindedly banging the drum for separation. That's a grim prospect for the rest of the country, but perhaps that's the way it'll be. Only in the corridors of the Scottish Government, alone in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, do we see a government determined to keep us stuck in the past. The rest of the UK moving on, Scotland left behind. And there's a real tragedy here too. This government promised a fresh start after the division of the 2014 referendum. And in the First Minister's own words, she made a heartfelt promise to serve all Scots regardless of how they voted in that referendum. How hollow it all sounds now. Instead of healing the divisions of 2014, this government has exacerbated them. Instead of the fresh start promised, we have had 5 years of unceasing agitation for independence. Instead of a laser-like focus on education, health and the economy, they all have been sidelined in favour of this First Minister's singular priority.
First Minister.
In his speech, is he going to address the fact that in 2 days' time, Scotland will be taken out of the European Union against our will? He used to oppose that. He's now a born-again Brexiteer, but I think the people of Scotland perhaps deserve to hear him justify that fact.
Jackson Carlo.
I'm speaking to the amendment in my name which concentrates on the priorities the people of Scotland actually want to see addressed. Most people will see the last 5 years as a catalogue of wasted opportunities to improve Scotland. You know, that's the real material change in circumstances, public service failure under the SNP. Most people want this government, this parliament, all of us to dedicate our efforts to the education, health, prosperity and well-being of our people. Isn't it about time this government listened to the voice of most people? Isn't it time this First Minister finally acted on the pledge she made back at the start of her term in office to serve all Scots and the interests of all Scots, whether they voted for or against independence? Isn't it time this First Minister and this government put aside their endless campaign for another constitutional, for a vote a consistent majority of the people of this country don't want, and instead focused on the real priorities of our country? Today, another 2.5 hours of parliamentary time will be wasted on debating yet another statement on independence, in which there was nothing new. That's all to be saved for other people, not this Parliament, on Friday. Instead, let's get back to the business the people outside this chamber elected us to deal with. Presiding Officer, First Minister, make this the last such debate. We're fed up.
Thank you, and I call Richard Leonard to open for the Labour Party.
Presiding Officer, I completely understand that the thought of 5 more years of a Boris Johnson government is driving some people to despair and yet others to anger, that there is widespread discontent. But what must be understood in this Parliament, in this debate this afternoon, is that the people of Scotland do not want another independence referendum anytime soon. Because they know, the people know, and they apply common sense to this question. They know that we need to do some hard thinking and work hard through the Brexit situation, and they know that until we do that, given the profound uncertainty about the nature and terms of our future economic relationship, our trading relationship, and the future social and cultural relationships between the people of the United Kingdom and the people of the European Union, that a referendum in 2020 makes no sense whatsoever. And that is the proposition that we are being asked to vote on this afternoon. The First Minister herself has said that a second independence referendum should not happen until after Brexit was done. Well, Brexit is not done, and it will not be done in 2020. So where the government motion talks of a material change in circumstances, we do not yet know what those changes will be. And however lofty the First Minister's rhetoric is, she knows, everybody knows, that in the end, this afternoon, the First Minister is playing a game, because nobody in this chamber really believes that there will be a referendum this year. I'm not sure that many people in this chamber really believe that there should be a referendum this year. So members of this Parliament are being asked to vote for what they know to be is a falsehood, and many of them are prepared to do it willingly. This debate today is not an example of a good use of power. The First Minister claims to be speaking for Scotland, but she is not even speaking to Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon is using this Parliament to speak to her own party, and she is not even telling them the truth. So it is rather contemptuous. It is a rather contemptuous use of power, the power that the government is using this Parliament for this afternoon. The government's motion is a synthetic political manufacture dressed up as high principle. It is our duty as members of this Parliament to expose that and to offer real leadership on this question. And it is our duty to represent all of the people, not just to placate an over-agitated political base of activists. And we know the numbers in this Parliament, and that the Greens will support this motion today. Although I say to the Greens, in all sincerity, that a turn to nationalism at the time of a global economic and climate crisis is a move in precisely the wrong direction. We should not be putting national boundaries up, we should be pulling national boundaries down. And our objective as members of this Parliament is to promote the welfare of the people, not just the material welfare, but welfare in the broader sense. So in our amendment, we call on the government to focus its energies on minimising the impact of the Tories' disastrous Brexit deal, to double down on ensuring that in the coming months, powers are repatriated to Scotland during the Brexit process, to focus on establishing a new home rule principle fit for the 21st century, where in the wake of Brexit, all that can be devolved is devolved, and not just to the Scottish Parliament, but to local government and to local communities right across Scotland. It is a vision of a modern 2020 Home Rule which recognises that we need to radically redistribute wealth and power by tackling inequalities, rather than simply reproducing them in a separate Scottish state. I'm in my last minute. It is a realistic vision of a redistribution of power, not just between parliaments, but a redistribution of power and wealth between people too, because that is where, in the end, the real divisions in our society really lie. And that means we must amend and extend the financial powers of this Parliament. We must start to use the powers that we already have for planning our economy, building the homes that our families need, tackling the long-standing challenges of public health, giving hope to our young people,
Order, please.
giving dignity to our pensioners in retirement, meeting the challenges of climate change, of technological change, of creating the caring society, extending democracy into our economy and into our communities, and so creating a more tolerant, equal Scotland. That should be this Parliament's priority, giving people hope over fear. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Before I call Willie Rennie to speak on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, could I just ask members just to stop the ongoing heckling? And this applies to members across the chamber. Can I particularly ask members of front benches not to do so? Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I did wonder this afternoon when I saw the wording of this motion and the fact that we're going to have 2 speeches this week on independence, not just 1, but 2, whether this debate was actually for me or whether it was for the different factions of the SNP to sort out whether they were going to move for a referendum now, next year, ever. What kind of timing, what kind of framework? Was it going to be a wildcat referendum? Was it not? But of course, I like to engage in these kind of debates, if not just to put the SNP right on these important constitutional issues. I'm intrigued at the fact that Alex Neil, that Brexiteer, is using Brexit as a justification for having another independence referendum. Not just a referendum, but a wildcat referendum backed by Mary Black and Joanna Cherry and a few others, I'm sure, and Kenny McCaskill, who says that we shouldn't have another independence referendum just now. We should focus on the day job. Probably the first time I've ever agreed with Kenny McCaskill, and has actually led to some people saying we should bring Kenny back. I'm not sure whether that would be met with wild appreciation. Or Mike Russell, who thinks it's racist to heckle Ian Blackford in Westminster while heckling Willie Rennie in this chamber. So, but of course it's important in this week, it is important to mark this moment, because this is a sad week. For pro-Europeans like me, it is a sad week. We are leaving the European Union. We fought hard every step of the way, not just when it was politically convenient to do so, but every step of the way. We spent more in the European election than we did on the Shetland by-election. Who would have thought that? It was important to stand up for what we believed, and we did so in that campaign. So this week is a sad week for pro-Europeans. But we should learn the lessons of Brexit, not repeat them with independence. We've had years of division over Brexit and independence before that. People are sick, fed up of it. They want to move on to the big challenges that the country faces. Just look at the division that we faced all those years ago in 2014. Friends, families, neighbours, business people divided over the issue of independence. Just the same was repeated on Brexit too. Look at all that investment that was held back in all those years during the independence debate and the Brexit debate as well. We should not be repeating those mistakes all over again. So let's learn the lessons of Brexit. Let's look to the Irish border. Let's look to the problems that that's caused in those communities. Let's learn those lessons. We have deep-rooted relationships between people north and south of the border in the United Kingdom. Deep-rooted relationships. And those have been lasting for 300 years. We've seen the turmoil that comes with breaking up a 45-year-old partnership with the European Union. Just imagine how much more difficult it would be to break up a partnership of 300 years. But the argument about the mandate, apparently this afternoon the SNP will claim that this Parliament has voted again for a mandate for another independence referendum. I disagree. The SNP do not have a majority in this Parliament. They do not have a majority in this Parliament. The Greens put forward a proposal in 2016 to say that they would need 1 million signatures on a petition. Now, I've hunted high and low, and I cannot find this petition. I would be surprised it's got one name on it, let alone 1 million names on this petition. So they will not have a mandate this afternoon. And to claim the general election is a mandate as well is false. It has already been referenced that the SNP did well in the general election. I admit that. But 45% is not any more votes. In fact, because the turnout was lower than the referendum in 2014, it's even fewer votes than they got in 2014. So there's no change at all for that. I thought they supported a PR voting system as well, a fair voting system. But all of a sudden they're claiming that having 47 or 48 MPs is also a mandate, but it isn't. And I also remember Nicola Sturgeon in the general election softening the message in the last week. I remember her appealing to people who were in favour of the United Kingdom. Not just now. I remember those people who were saying they favour, not just now. I will come to the First Minister in a second when I am ready. So when the First Minister in that election, she softened the message. She appealed to Labour voters, to Liberal Democrats, to say, come with us to stop Boris, not just now. Come with us to stop Boris Johnson. Hardly any mention of independence at that stage. Then it was ramped right up after the general election. She does not have a mandate for independence. I'll give way to the First Minister.
Willie Rennie has set out today what, in his view, does not constitute a mandate for an independence referendum. Perhaps he'd use some of his time now to tell us what, in his view, would constitute a mandate for an independence referendum, and we might make some progress.
Willie Rennie.
I am not obsessed about independence. I do not think every day of the week how we're going to get another independence referendum. I can guarantee you, if you vote Liberal Democrat, we will use every opportunity to vote against independence because it's dividing our country and it's damaging our economy. And I don't know, Presiding Officer, whether they're following your encouragement to be a little bit more quiet in this debate, but I suspect they are not. But what we need to recognise is that the SNP do not have that mandate. And as far as I'm concerned, if you vote Liberal Democrat, they will never have that mandate. We need to move on. We need to unite the country. We need to tackle the challenges that we all face. And if we do that, we'll have a better Scotland and a better United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. And I call on... I would encourage members again not to heckle too loudly, please. Patrick Harvie to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In a week when we've heard that even a Conservative leadership candidate thinks that it's those who've been banging the no Indy Ref 2 drum who sound obsessed with independence, I have to say that I think Willie Rennie might even do well to listen to the sage words of wisdom from Michelle Ballantyne. I am delighted to be here, to be able to join with others, not in asserting, but in reasserting, yes, the existing mandate for putting the future of Scotland back into the hands of the people who matter, the people who should make the decision, the people who live here. And I really think that the Conservative position of saying that the sovereign right of the people of Scotland was exercised in 2014 is such a partial position. It's as though they can only see 2014 and they cannot see the subsequent exercise of the right of the people of Scotland to say something about their future in the European referendum in 2016, where they said very clearly that they wanted to remain. In the pro-independence result of the majority of people that they sent to the Scottish Parliament in 2016, and in the pro-independence majorities of the candidates they elected in 2017, in 2019, 3 out of 6 in the European election as well in 2019, and even those who defend first past the post, who claim that 43% for a UK government is a mandate to do whatever the hell they like to the people of the UK and Scotland, refuse to accept that a pro-independence majority of MPs is a mandate in Scotland. Jackson Carlaw says that those who support independence are stuck in the past. I would suggest that it's the Empire 2.0 fans in the Brexit extremist faction which has taken over his party who are stuck in the past. And the reality is for the Conservatives now that though once upon a time the Scottish Conservatives used to pretend to be the moderates within the Conservatives in these islands, there are no Tory moderates anymore. They have all thrown their lot in with the Brexit extremists and with the Boris Johnson regime. Everything that government does is now on them. There are no more Tory moderates. As for the Labour position, and I certainly would say to Richard Leonard, yes, the Scottish Green Party is proudly pro-independence and not nationalist, because we understand the two are not the same thing. And I hope he would respect the fact, he would respect the fact that as someone who supports membership of the UK, I would never call him a British nationalist. These points of language matter. Nationalism is not the only factor that can lead someone to express a view about sovereignty and about our future. And do the Greens ever argue against the odds? He says we're being asked to support something we know isn't going to happen. Do the Greens ever argue against the odds? Yes, of course we do. Maybe last month when Richard Leonard was arguing for a UK Labour government, he knew that wasn't about to happen either in his heart of hearts. So yes, we have to assert sometimes against the odds. As for his argument on home rule, I still have to ask myself, what is it? What is it? And how, even if they can put forward a solid, well-defined, fleshed-out proposition for what home rule means, how does it escape the same problem that not only independence, but everything from powers over drug laws to a Scottish visa system encounters? That same problem, UK says no. And UK will keep saying no until the people of Scotland are given the ability to assert their sovereign right. And as for the Liberal Democrat position, the motion there does say that the domestic agenda matters. And yes, of course, the domestic agenda matters. That applies to all of us, whichever side of the independence debate we're on. And the Greens regularly challenge the Scottish Government on their support for the oil and gas industry, on their education policies, on their support for aviation growth, and on other issues. But none of that should prevent Scotland from also debating its future beyond those currently devolved powers. And even just picking one example from the Liberal Democrat amendment, fuel poverty. We know that fuel poverty is determined, yes, by energy efficiency and by things that the Housing Minister can do to reduce energy consumption, but also by energy prices and incomes. And it's the approach of the UK government, including those Conservatives that Willie Rennie's party put into power in the first place, which have had such a deleterious effect. Presiding Officer, there is, we know, objective harm coming from Brexit. Economic harm, social harm and environmental harm. And Greens will oppose that because of the political position that we've taken throughout. But there is also, I'll take one brief intervention if it's time.
It's my view that all powers should be devolved unless there's an overwhelming reason not to devolve those powers. And I think there are some powers where there is an overwhelming reason not to. With accepting that all powers should be coming to Scotland, does he accept that that is accepting that harm will occur from that also?
Patrick Harvey.
Well, if Neil Findlay's party had taken that position during the Smith Commission, there is a whole swathe of powers on employment law, on the rights that we have in the workplace, which Mr Findlay's party should have recognised. There was no reason to keep reserved to the UK level. Look, aside from the objective harm that is coming from Brexit, there is a point of principle involved here. Scotland, though I disagreed with the result in 2014, Scotland over recent years has voted in favour of both unions, and it is now being told that it cannot have what it voted for. There is a democratic choice being made today in the European Parliament as to whether to support that EU withdrawal agreement. A democratic choice has been made by a UK Parliament that wasn't elected with a majority from Scotland, and it's only the people of Scotland whose voices are being ignored or overruled. Not only the voters of Scotland, but also Scotland's Parliament, because that EU withdrawal agreement required and failed to be given legislative consent by this Parliament. Scotland is not being given the respect for that claim of right, that sovereignty of the people who live in Scotland. That is not being respected by the UK government, and the only way to change that is for Scotland, the people who live here, to be given the right to make that decision for themselves again. Greens on Friday will be relaunching with campaign events in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the Green Yes campaign. We are ready to go out and fight that campaign, and we look forward. Even if the UK government does continue saying no, we'll look forward to continuing to say Scotland demands.
Thank you very much. Now, I didn't want to stop the member mid-flow, but could I just urge the member to be careful about his use of language and not use expressions that would be regarded as offensive elsewhere. I'm not trying to suppress this. It's a passionate debate. Just please keep it respectful. Can I call Tom Arthur to be followed by Murdo Fraser?
Presiding officer, in a little over 48 hours, the majority of people in Scotland will in effect cease to be citizens of the European Union. I am one of those set to be stripped of my citizenship. I have no means of reobtaining it under our current constitutional settlement, my ancestry being too distant to qualify for an Irish passport. For me, this is a very bitter and hurtful experience. I struggle to imagine what Brexit must feel like for those EU nationals who have made Scotland their home. I know just as I and many others who have valued our place in the EU will be hurting, there will be many in Scotland who will welcome our departure. Over 1 million people in Scotland voted to leave, including many in my constituency of Renfrewshire South. I believe that the overwhelming majority of those who voted leave did so for honourable and principled reasons, motivated by desire to protect the interests of their families, community and country. Similarly, I believe that the 3.6 million people who voted in 2014, both yes and no, cast their vote based upon their honest judgment of what was in the country's best interests at that time. Presiding officer, the experience of Brexit as someone who voted Remain has, I believe, given me an insight into what those who opposed Scottish independence may have been feeling as the polls narrowed in September 2014. Anxiety, fear, perhaps even a sense of unreality. I know constituents who passionately value their British citizenship and sense of British identity, often alongside an equally passionate sense of Scottish and European identity. I am their MSP too, and I will always be a staunch advocate for all of my constituents in Renfrewshire South. It is with that sense of responsibility that I approach this debate on Scotland's future, a debate which at the time of my election to this Parliament in 2016 I did not expect we would be having. I stood in a manifesto that called for a referendum on independence only should there be a material change in circumstances. The then hypothetical scenario of Scotland voting to remain in the EU but being forced to leave because of votes elsewhere in the UK was specifically given as one such material change in circumstances. I said that I would have not expected to be having this debate, and that is because in 2016 I did not expect the people of England and Wales to vote by majority in favour of leaving the EU. Had they voted as I hoped, then we would not be leaving the EU on Friday, and the threshold of a material change would not have been met. Equally, had Scotland joined England and Wales in voting leave, then I would have sought to work with colleagues to implement the decision of the people we all serve. However, the people of Scotland did not vote to leave. They voted by an overwhelming majority to remain and have taken every opportunity at the ballot box to reaffirm that decision. Scotland being taken out of the European Union against the democratically expressed wishes of the Scottish people is a material change in circumstances. We cannot simply ignore this and pretend that it didn't happen. Presiding Officer, the UK is a union state. It can exist only with the consent of its members. Scotland is not a city like London or an English county. It is a nation, a country in its own right, just as much as Ireland or Denmark or New Zealand are countries in their own right. And it is the people of Scotland who are sovereign. Presiding Officer, I'm going to turn to the question of timing which has been raised. Had the UK negotiated a form of Brexit that maintained membership of the single market and customs union, or provided for a differentiated settlement for Scotland, then it would have been reasonable to question whether a referendum was required on the timescale proposed by the Scottish Government. However, it is the UK Government's policy to pursue divergence from the single market and to leave the customs union. They have also ruled out any extension of the transition period beyond the end of this year. Therefore, there is a powerful case for people in Scotland having the opportunity to choose, in principle, independence in Europe before divergence makes that proposition more difficult to obtain. On the broader question, I'm afraid I don't have time, otherwise I would. Of the broader question of timing and the oft-repeated line of once in a generation, I will say this. In all honesty, following the referendum in 2014, I did not see the circumstances arising that would justify revisiting the question of Scottish independence in the near future, though other more experienced heads did. My thinking was also informed by the political dynamics of the previous 50 years of constitutional politics in Scotland. Consider the following pairs of dates: 1967 to 1970, 1974 to 1979, 1988 to 1992. There was a clear pattern of SNP electoral success, movement on the constitutional question from opponents of independence, followed by reduced support or underperformance of the SNP, then the only vehicle for those wishing to express an appetite for constitutional change in Scotland. Following the devolution referendum of 1997, it was not until 2007 that the SNP became the largest party, and only by a single seat. While not a universal view, I am sure that there were many who, prior to 2014, would have forecast the SNP to go into a period of decline following a no vote. Well, that didn't happen. Presiding Officer, the events since 2014 are without precedent. Scotland has consistently returned a pro-independence majority of parliamentarians, and the constitutional settlement of 2014 no longer exists. We are a nation, we are a country, and it is the people who are sovereign, not this Parliament, not Westminster, and not the Crown. We, the people of Scotland, will determine our future, and if a majority choose, as I hope they will, independence, then Scotland will be an independent country.
Thank you. I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It tells us all we need to know about this SNP government, that they are devoting debating time this afternoon to the one thing they know is not going to happen in 2020, and that is a total irrelevance to Scotland's future, being an independence referendum. An independence referendum will not happen because there is no legal power for this Parliament to hold such a referendum, because there is no broader political support for it outside the ranks of the nationalist parties in this chamber, and because there is no public support for it happening. And yet we should not be surprised that the SNP are spending their debating time on this issue, the one issue they are obsessed with above everything else. Because this is a party who cannot find debating time to discuss education, but would rather focus on the one issue that distracts their followers away from all their manifest failures across the public services. So, Presiding Officer, instead of debating independence this afternoon, what we should be debating are the SNP's failures in education, where the most recent PISA figures have recorded our worst ever results in science and maths, where we see teacher numbers lower today than when the SNP took power, where today we learn that the government is set to miss its own targets to improve attainment amongst pupils in deprived areas, where we see real issues with the implementation of curriculum for excellence, where leading figures in Scottish education like Keir Bloomer and Professor Lindsay Patterson have called for an urgent rethink before a generation of young people are failed, and where, despite all the promises made by the SNP to wipe out student debt, we learned last week that Scottish students have an accumulated debt that has doubled over the past decade. Presiding Officer, we should be debating this afternoon the SNP's track record on health, where no fewer than 6 geographical health boards are now in special measures due to performance and management issues, where the 12-week treatment guarantee has never been met under this SNP government, and where barely 3 in 4 patients are seen within the 18-week referral to treatment period, according to the latest statistics, where children have died in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, and today we learn that as many as 80 children could have contracted infections, where the new Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh is years late and costing £1.4 million a month to the taxpayer, where Scotland is now the worst place in the EU for drug deaths after the sharpest rise ever in fatalities, following on from a reduction in rehabilitation beds by 80% since the SNP came to power, and where the number of young people waiting for a referral for mental health treatment is increasing, with more children waiting longer than a year. Presiding Officer, we should this afternoon be discussing the issues with our police, issues so severe that they have led to the Chief Constable Ian Livingston speaking out against underfunding of the police by the Scottish Government, with 750 officer jobs at risk, where the police estate is in the worst condition it has ever been, where I witnessed for myself recently water running down the walls and tiles coming loose in the police station in Pitlochry, and the roof falling in the Justice Secretary's, in the Justice Secretary's local station in Broughty Ferry. Presiding Officer, we should be discussing failures in the toxicology service, where some families will be waiting a year to get results to tell them how their loved ones have died. Presiding Officer, we should be discussing this government's ferries fiasco, where we're looking at a £100 million overspend for the delivery of 2 CalMac ferries by the Ferguson Yard in Inverclyde, a contract running at least 2 years late, with a whole host of unanswered questions as to why the Yard was given the contract in the first place, and why Scottish ministers sat on their hands for years when they should have been intervening at a far earlier stage, instead of watching taxpayers' money being wasted and island communities badly let down. Presiding Officer, we should be discussing issues with the Scottish economy, where we are in a decade of serial underperformance compared to the UK average, and where figures out this morning tell us that over the past year our economy grew at less than half the UK rate. Yes, I'll go wait, Mr Swinney.
Deputy First Minister.
If Mr Fraser would care to reflect on all of the issues he has raised today and answer this question to me, why, if all of that is the case, did the Conservatives lose half of their parliamentary constituencies in the election in December? Why are the Tories so awful in Scotland?
Murdo Fraser.
I'd remind very gently, Mr Swinney, despite all the campaigning that has been done, they couldn't get more than 45% to support the opposition. The proposition, well, there should be another independence referendum. They don't speak for the majority, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we should be discussing the fact that the employment gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK is at its highest for 2 decades, at 2%, representing at least 30,000 adults of working age who are economically inactive, who could be contributing to Scotland's economy, driving forward growth and contributing to tax revenue. Presiding Officer, we should be debating last week's Scottish Trends report, in the very week that the First Minister was calling for us to measure our economy, not by growth, but rather by well-being. We saw the publication of this comparative index of social and economic well-being across 32 OECD countries, which showed Scotland falling down the table into the 3rd quartile for the first time due to the decline in education and income performances, with our poor life expectancy performance our weakest area. Presiding Officer, we should be discussing Scotland's tax position, where decisions made by this SNP government have made Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, and we see a £1 billion black hole in the Scottish public finances due to an over-forecast of devolved tax revenues, meaning that in future public services will suffer due to this government's failure to create the environment for a growing economy. And we should be discussing local government in Scotland, which has seen cuts to core funding of more than 7% over the past 6 years, putting at risk vital local services. Presiding Officer, this is the record of this SNP government after nearly 13 years in office, These are the issues they should be tackling. These are the problems facing Scotland today, which they are ignoring because of their obsession with independence. Presiding Officer, this Parliament is here to hold this Scottish Government to account, to highlight the matters under its responsibility, not to waste its time posturing on constitutional questions. Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland are sick fed up of this government and its independence obsession. It needs to stop this nonsense and get on with the day job.
Thank you. I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Elaine Smith. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to have been called to speak in this important debate this afternoon on the rights of the people of Scotland to choose their own future. And at the outset, it would perhaps be useful to restate the fundamental constitutional principle underlying our democracy in Scotland. And that is that sovereignty lies with the people of Scotland, not this Parliament, not the Westminster Parliament, and not Boris Johnson nor the Tory party. That means that the sovereignty of the people of Scotland is not time-limited, it is not subject to a cut-off period, and it is not capable of being unilaterally and indefinitely suspended by political parties. Hence the contention by the Conservative Party and others that since the sovereign right of the people of Scotland was exercised in 2014, the sovereign rights of the people of Scotland are to be put on pause until some unspecified date in the future is, of course, a constitutional nonsense as a matter of law, and it is also anti-democratic. Turning, Presiding Officer, to the situation we in Scotland now face, as a matter of fact, we did indeed have a most fantastic engagement on the part of the people of Scotland in the 2014 independence referendum. And we did see in the course of that campaign a number of key interventions made, including the infamous vow and the unequivocal statements made by those advocating a no vote, that the only way to protect Scotland's membership of the EU was to vote no to independence. But what we have seen since, Presiding Officer, is regrettably, and I would submit entirely predictable, a whole host of broken promises, the vow not delivered, our EU citizenship indeed being removed, notwithstanding the undertakings to the contrary, our views ignored. What happened to the love, Presiding Officer? What happened to lead us, don't leave us? Whether the respect agenda for, as has been said at 11 o'clock on Friday, night, Scotland will be dragged out of the EU against our will. All the Scottish Government's sensible compromise proposals over the last 3 years or so for staying, for example, in the EU single market and customs union have been simply ignored. No seat for Scotland, no seat for Scotland in key talks either over the last 3.5 years or at any stage in the future. Our detailed proposals, as the First Minister mentioned, for a Scottish visa put forward on Monday of this week to tackle the damaging economic consequences of the end of free movement, dismissed simply by the UK Government on Tuesday without even being properly considered. Or take this, for example, the UK Tory Government ensuring that once again our fishing industry is to be sold down the river on the way out of the EU, just as it was by a UK Tory Government on the way in to the EU. So this is where we are at the start of 2020, in a very different place to the one that we were promised. But we in Scotland do not need to blithely accept this. We do not need to go back into the cupboard and just shut up. And we know that the people of Scotland do not want that to happen, for indeed, in each of the past 4 parliamentary elections, the SNP has won each of them. The Scottish parliamentary election in 2016, the 2017 Westminster election, the 2019 European Parliament election, and the 2019 Westminster election. In each of those elections, the SNP stood on an unequivocal manifesto on the right of the people of Scotland to choose their future in an independence referendum in the event of a significant material change in circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. No, I won't take an intervention, thank you. So it is quite clear that that was the manifesto on which the SNP fought and won each of those 4 elections. Moreover, this Parliament has backed that position, and of course we will see today whether this Parliament reaffirms that mandate at voting tonight. That is, Presiding Officer, the democratic position, and that is the position that must be respected. Of course, I can understand why the UK-controlled parties advocating a no vote, that is the Tories, Labour and the Liberals, do not want there to be an independence referendum, for it is evident that they are running scared. But they cannot turn their face against the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland. That is the untenable position, Presiding Officer. That is the unsustainable position, and that position simply cannot prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Elaine Smith to be followed by Jenny Gilruth. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So another day, another call by the First Minister for another referendum on independence. But of course we did have one, and the Scottish people gave their opinion, and there is no indication that the majority of Scottish people want another referendum right now. Far from it. And the First Minister knows fine well that even within her own party there's not agreement on her urgency for a referendum. Indeed, Jim Sillars in the Scotsman this morning has warned that, and I quote, "It's a longer process than a few months, and one that cannot have any worth until we know the final details of the Brexit negotiations." So with regard to that, the priority of this Parliament going forward should be to keep our devolved powers and resist attempts by the UK Government to cut across the devolution settlement by attempting to make secondary legislation in devolved areas without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. And we need to dedicate our attention to the eventual outcome of the UK's withdrawal from the EU, a journey, of course, which is going to begin in a couple of days. And the challenge that we face as we begin this Tory withdrawal from the EU is to minimise disruption on Scottish businesses, local authorities, communities and our citizens, rather than cause further constitutional upheaval. And meanwhile, also in the Scotsman today, on the front page, and I'll just read the headline, "Growing Health Gap Exposed Between Scots Rich and Poor." This is about a report on the Scottish Government's own statistics, which show a widening health inequalities gap. The poorest Scots are 4 times more likely to die prematurely. Surely this should be a priority for debate in the Chamber, but instead today we're debating flags in the Constitution. Certainly.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. Does it cross her mind that, with all these health and other problems that she's listing, when we compare ourselves with a country, say, like Denmark or Norway, one of the differences with them is they are independent?
We'll be coming in a minute to comparisons, actually, Mr Mason. So what I would say is that after 13 years in office, and I think the intervention maybe showed this, it's hardly surprising that complacency has become normal for the Scottish Government. And it's also become normal for the Scottish Government to dismiss concerns or to blame others when it comes to their mismanagement and underfunding of public services. And with regard to cutting to the bone and beyond, council funding, such cuts could result in the loss of vital local services. For example, in my area, North Lanarkshire Council's Kilbowie Outdoor Centre, or here in Edinburgh, schools and nurseries facing a £1.8 million in cuts over the next 2 years. And actually, the local EIS secretaries warned of an already desperate situation where teachers are putting their hands in their own pockets to buy basic materials, including pens, pencils and rulers. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is letting Scotland down in too many ways to list at the moment in the time I have to speak. But on the other hand, the Scottish Government has many powers that are not being used. For example, the power to reform the council tax, which I believe they promised to do and which could help to address local government underfunding. Our children are paying the consequences of cuts to school budgets, and the failure to deliver on personal care is leading to distress for many families and to delayed discharge from hospitals, which are already struggling to cope. The blinkered view that independence is the solution to the problems facing Scotland's families and communities leads to a failure of governance. More flexibility, creativity and the political will could make much more effective use of the devolved powers that we already have. And in fighting the drugs epidemic in Scotland, for example, we could use all our devolved powers over health, policing, justice and public services to make an effective intervention and to save lives. And seriously, what can be more important than removing Scotland from the top of the list for drugs-related deaths per capita in Europe? Another priority should be the immediate implementation of those benefits that have already been transferred over from Westminster. And I'm sure many in the SNP will agree with me when I say that people are denied dignity and fairness by the punitive regime of the DWP. But when we could already be rolling out a new humanely delivered disability assistance scheme without the degrading assessments conducted by private companies, the Scottish Government has failed to take control and people are suffering while they wait for change. So when we consider that more children in households with a disabled family member are living in poverty, not only could we be starting to give disabled people the dignity they deserve, but we could also be further tackling child poverty. And we know that people are pushed to the brink every day by DWP decisions. They're humiliated and degraded by unnecessary and intrusive assessments. So why on earth would this government delay taking control of these benefits? Presiding Officer, child poverty, according to the Resolution Foundation, is on an upward trajectory, and our 2030 target will never be achieved if addressing child poverty is not a top priority. The government should be finding ways to empower local government through legislation and fair funding, devolving power away from the centre and not grabbing it back in. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government should shake off its complacency and take a fresh look at the powers we already have and fully use them, rather than insist the solution is another divisive referendum on independence. And I have to say it was divisive in my area. It was definitely not respectful civic engagement. What we need right now is this devolved Parliament, which was, remember, delivered by the Labour Party, to be a Scottish People's Parliament which uses to the full the extensive powers already devolved, gains the appropriate repatriated Brexit powers and seeks further devolution in areas such as employment rights and equality. A Parliament here in Scotland which gives priority to tackling poverty, inequality and injustice, because that's what members of this Parliament were elected to do.
Thank you very much. I call Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Donald Cameron. Ms Gilruth, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start today by apologising to my constituents in Mid-Fife and Glenrothes, to the European nationals who I represent. I am so sorry. You have been let down. This is your country. Please stay with us. Presiding Officer, Friday will be a sad day for our fellow Europeans. Folk like my uncle Knut, who came here from Berlin. Folk like my friend Magic, who came here from Poland. Folk like my constituent, who has lived here for nearly 30 years, working as a foster carer for Fife Council, and who has been denied settled status on 3 occasions. I am so sorry. You don't deserve to be treated like this. Since the Brexit vote in 2016, hate crime has increased across the United Kingdom. In July 2016, police recorded a 41% increase in the number of racially or religious aggravated crimes in England and Wales compared to the same month the year before. Police Scotland figures from 2019 recorded 6,736 hate crimes in 17-18, a rise of 2.4% on the previous year. More than 2/3 of the incidents were race-related. 3 of the 4 Welsh police forces have reported rises in racism and race-related hate crimes since the 2016 referendum. Hate has also seeped into our political discourse, changing the acceptability of language which would previously not have been thought acceptable. Take Conservative Party Chairman James Cleverly, who last year said that Brexit was a warning shot and argued that democracy breaks if votes are not respected. Or our Prime Minister, who has openly described those who try to block Brexit as surrender operatives, with the Benn legislation compared to the Surrender Act. And just last week, one of Labour's leadership contenders, Emily Thornberry, decried that she hated the SNP. Setting aside the sheer paucity of intellect exhibited by all 3, it is clear that language matters in politics. Hate speak is easy to trip off the tongue, so blame someone else, blame another party for your electoral defeats, and quickly you create a culture in which hate becomes normalised and understanding evaporates. As the motion today states, the SNP's manifesto commitment was absolutely clear in 2016. We would only seek a second independence referendum should there be a significant material change in circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. And I would invite any member of the opposition to tell me EU citizens living in Scotland, contributing to our communities, giving love and protection to some of the most vulnerable children in society, breaking down in tears because of the threat that they might be forced to leave after Brexit, isn't a change in circumstance. Tell me that Scotland's vote to remain in the European Union wasn't about the people of Scotland desiring something different to the Brexit crisis which has engulfed UK politics since June 2016. No member of the opposition can. But, Presiding Officer, then neither can I. Because the simple truth of the matter is, we have not asked the people. What is it about the opposition that terrifies them so much about a second independence referendum? It seems sensible to conclude that, unlike 2014, a visceral fear has arisen amongst the Unionist parties. The values enshrined by the Smith Commission, which focused on inclusive engagement, have been replaced by a new policy narrative. We said no, we meant it. No means no. You need a mandate in 2021. Or my particular favourite from Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack, even if you win in 2021, you still can't have a referendum. It is not going to hold, and they know it. This is precisely why they are now running scared. This is why the UK Government didn't even bother to read the sensible proposals put forward by the Scottish Government this week on migration. The pretence of mutual respect has gone. Jackson Carlaw's amendment today points to the more than 2 million people who voted to reject independence in 2014. I know one of those 2 million very well. I also know friends who voted no and yet who voted SNP in the general election for the first time in their lives in December. These people exist, and whilst they may not yet be convinced of the merits of independence, why should Westminster deny them the opportunity to choose once again? The same body politic that promised our constituents a vote to stay in the UK would guarantee them European Union membership. Presiding Officer, the people might say no once more. They might opt to stay part of the United Kingdom out of Europe, but that should be for the people to decide. The amendments from the Conservatives and the Liberals today are predictably blinkered to the reality that Brexit has fundamentally shifted the focus of UK and Scottish politics. Banging the day job drum when the UK Government shut down Parliament last year to stifle debate, the sheer hypocrisy. 61% of the Scottish population now believe that Holyrood should decide on holding a future referendum on independence. So what today's debate is about is Scotland's right to choose. It's not about dictating to the people one way or the other. Sovereignty lies with the people, as my colleague Annabel Ewing said earlier. It's not about saying, it's about saying that there's another way to govern our country, and whether or not you agree with that immutable fact, you should have a say on it. James Wilson was one of the founding fathers of the United States, and he was born at Cascardo Farm, near Ceres, where I was brought up. Writing some 230 years ago, he said, "Does man exist for the sake of government, or is government instituted for the sake of man?" Presiding Officer, I hope the Chamber will listen to the words of my fellow Fifer, Mr Wilson. Scotland voted to remain. The UK voted to leave. Scotland is meant to be an equal partner in this union of nations, but Westminster remains cloth-eared to this political reality. Government should exist for the sake of the people, so let the people decide our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Donald Cameron, to be followed by Alec Neil. Mr Cameron, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, what a day. A day of flags and the Constitution, but categorically not a day for debating our public services, as many others across this chamber have already pointed out. Not a day for debating matters that affect the everyday lives of people in Scotland. Because a government with a strong record of delivery on education, on the NHS, on transport, on broadband, would of course want to debate such matters. But not this government. I wonder why. Why does the SNP want to talk about the Constitution instead of talking about its domestic achievements? Well, let me try and answer that by looking at the region that I represent. Because the Highlands and Islands have been left behind by this government more than most places. Look first at education. Audit Scotland's recent report into the performance of Highland Council was just one example of a failure in a portfolio area, which is, of course, the First Minister's priority. Audit Scotland's report said that performance against national benchmarking indicators has deteriorated over a 5-year period with poor performance in priority areas, including education. Last December, the most recent figures from the Scottish Government itself for Highland Council primary 7 pupils revealed that just 60% of them had reached the expected level for writing and only 54% of them for literacy. Even John Swinney is on record saying performance levels in Highland schools need to improve. And over the last year, both Highland Council and the Western Isles Council saw drops in teacher numbers, despite the government insisting that council teacher numbers must be maintained. But what about our health services? Well, in the NHS, the Highlands and Islands continues to have an issue with vacancies across the board, part of a severe staffing crisis that has existed since before I was elected. Just recently, my colleague Edward Mountain found that NHS Highland alone has spent more than £20 million on locums, bank and agency staff in the last financial year. And indeed, figures show on vacancies across all specialties between September 2018 and September 2019, there's been a 9.2% increase in vacancies in NHS Highland, a 10%, not yet, a 10% increase in NHS Grampian and a 25% increase in NHS Shetland. And in fact, just yesterday, it was reported that a new kidney dialysis service for Skye has been delayed due to recruitment problems. This is what matters to the people we represent. Yes, I will.
Gail Ross.
I thank Donald Cameron for taking an intervention. He talks about recruitment crisis in the NHS. Does he agree with NHS managers that the loss of EU workers will make that even worse due to Brexit? And Highland Council's own figures estimate that the area will lose at least £100 million a year from Brexit.
Donald Cameron, you get your time back.
Thank you. Thank you. As I have often said, the crisis of staffing in our NHS began long before the 23rd of June 2016. And on top of the serious issues in staffing, NHS Highland continues to experience serious claims of bullying. Only yesterday, Gavin Smith from the GMB union told Good Morning Scotland that he has staff across the organisation that say they do not notice any change in the culture since the Starrett report. These are the issues that really concern our constituents, but are falling by the wayside. And why won't the SNP debate ferries? Because their stewardship of our ferry network has been a calamity. We now know that 2 new ferries will be even later than originally forecast. Need I remind the Scottish Government that CalMac in 2010 said that they would have to build a new ferry every year, just to stand still, and that of the existing fleet of ferries, almost 50% are beyond their 25-year life expectancy. That is what is damaging island communities, communities which care a lot more about their transport links than they do about the SNP's obsession with the Constitution. And lastly, broadband. If there was one area which the SNP really majored on in their 2016 and 2017 manifestos, it was the delivery of broadband. To recap, they promised to deliver superfast broadband to 100% of homes by 2021. No. Next year, a date selected by the SNP, no one else. It's their target and theirs alone. But despite all the grandstanding, we now know that homes and businesses across much of the Highlands and Islands will be lucky if they get superfast broadband by 2026. 5 years late. No. Another abject failure. Because this is what matters. And taken all together, is it any wonder why the SNP is so desperate to escape being held to account, given this abysmal record? But such avoidance of scrutiny doesn't end there, presiding officer. It is a running theme which continues right into this afternoon. When this debate was first announced, it was stated that its purpose was so that the First Minister could set out her plans in response to the UK government's refusal to authorise another independence referendum. I'm sorry she is no longer in the debate that she herself has led. The next steps were to be set out today, we were told. It was going to be the big reveal. And here we are, except we're not being told what these fabled next steps are, so we don't have the opportunity to debate them. We are left in the dark, boxing at shadows. We learnt nothing new today, because that announcement is being saved for Friday, apparently, after a late change of heart. Far from the madding crowd, far from the scrutiny of this chamber, the First Minister prefers the grand theatre of Bute House and Brexit Day for her big statement. A cynical move in and of itself, but made worse, presiding officer, much worse, by the fact that, having avoided proper interrogation of these next steps in this chamber today, the First Minister will nevertheless use tonight's vote as a rubber stamp for whatever she plans to come up with on Friday. That's the true affront to democracy, to use her phrase. So yes, presiding officer, what a day. The 29th of January 2020, a day that will go down in the history of this Parliament for all the wrong reasons. A day when the SNP want us to debate flags and accordingly usurp the decision of our very own corporate body. A day when the SNP want us to debate the Constitution rather than public services. And a day when the First Minister will lay claim to the will of Parliament without having the courage to put her detailed proposals to that Parliament. In short, presiding officer, a day when, from start to finish, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP have treated this Parliament and its institutions with contempt. And I support the amendment in Jackson Carlo's name.
Thank you very much. I call Alec Neil to be followed by Ian Gray. Mr Neil, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I would like to start with a quote from the late Donald Dewar, speaking in the devolution referendum bill debate in the House of Commons on the 21st of May 1997. And this is what Donald said: "I would be the last to challenge the sovereignty of the people or to deny them the right to opt for any solution to the constitutional question which they wished for. For example, if they want to go for independence, I see no reason why they should not do so. In fact, if they want to, they should. I should be the first to accept that. It is on that basis that I had no difficulty, perhaps this is a Scottish point, in signing the claim of right. And that does not imply that the people had to exercise their right by travelling in one particular road. I believe that the people have a right to a choice, but they have the right to every choice." And I say to Richard Leonard and the Labour Party, if you look at the wording of the motion before us today, that motion is an echo of the principles laid down by and adhered to by Donald Dewar and his colleagues in the passage of the legislation, first of all for a referendum and then on the establishment, I will in a minute, then in the establishment of this bill itself. And I listened to Mr Leonard very carefully. His only real issue was about the timing of a referendum. He doesn't want it this year. I can understand why he doesn't want it this year. But the point is, if you look at today's motion, it doesn't commit the Parliament at this stage to, no, read the motion, read the motion. The motion says at a place and a date and in a manner to be determined by the Scottish Parliament, not unilaterally by the Scottish Government. So I do not understand why the Labour Party now is reneging on the very fundamental principles that Donald Dewar laid out.
Neil Findlay.
With reference to Mr Neil's comments about the claim of right, absolutely, I concur with what Donald Dewar said then. But the issue, and he knows this more than anyone, is that we have no idea what the outcome of Brexit is. If he can tell me what the trading arrangements are, what the regulations are, if he can tell me all of that stuff, then I would say that we can go forward. But he knows we can't. And until that's clarified, we cannot follow on that basis.
Alec Neil.
That's a very fair point, and indeed the First Minister's on record a number of times as saying we need to know the broad shape of the Brexit deal before we can vote in an independence referendum. We obviously hope to know that at some point this year. But the point is, the resolution is what you're being asked to vote for, and the resolution says the date will be decided by the Scottish Parliament. It's not decided today, and therefore there is no excuse. If you believe in the claim of right, there is no excuse for voting against this motion today. Now, let me deal with Boris Johnson's position, because he has changed things dramatically. Every Prime Minister in living memory, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, David Cameron and Theresa May are all on record as saying that if the Scottish people at any time vote for independence, then independence they must get. They recognised that they had to fulfil the democratic wishes of the Scottish people if we vote for independence. And indeed, Theresa May, in turning down the proposal from the First Minister for a referendum this year, said in reply, now is not the time. But she didn't say you can never have a referendum. She didn't say if in 2021, I will in a minute, you win on the back of a mandate, an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament, if you have a mandate for a referendum, you still can't have it. She said, not now, but Boris Johnson is saying, no matter what the Scottish people say, not ever. That is totally unacceptable, not just to people in the SNP, it should be totally unacceptable to any self-respecting Scot.
Adam Tompkins.
The SNP have always said that, in our view, these kind of referendums are once-in-a-generation events. This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for people in Scotland. So said Nicola Sturgeon in September 2013. Now, I know the member doesn't always agree with his party leader, but does he not agree with that?
Alec Neil.
This is a nonsense. If you look at the Northern Ireland, if you look at the Good Friday Agreement, there are two provisions. First of all, it says very clearly, if there is a majority support for a referendum on reunification, that referendum should take place. And secondly, it provides that if a referendum takes place and it votes against reunification, there can be another referendum within a 7-year period. So the British government, in terms of the generation between referenda, has already defined it in law as 7 years. If it's good enough for Northern Ireland, why is it not good enough for Scotland? Because the Tory party has always held their country in contempt. They fought against devolution when it was clearly the majority wish of the Scottish people for a long time. And therefore, they now need to come to the table and say whether or not they are going to stand up to Boris Johnson, and if the Scottish people vote for a referendum, if they give a mandate next year for a referendum on independence, are they going to abide by that democratic decision, or are they going to ditch democracy as well?
Thank you. I call Ian Gray to be followed by Angela Constance. Mr Gray, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The government motion before us today is a bit of a classic of that rather disingenuous genre. It takes a simple statement of fact about what the Smith Commission said as if this was some clever reveal, a rabbit pulled out of the hat, instead of something that we all know perfectly well the Smith Commission said. And then it tries to ascribe to it a meaning it patently doesn't have. The truth is that the phrase quoted in the motion is simply the Commission's response to a straw man argument mounted by the SNP at the time. The early days of the Commission were spent listening to the tiresome angst of the SNP that if they signed up to a more powerful devolved settlement, then that would be taken to mean that they'd given up on their purpose of independence, as if empowering this Parliament was somehow a kind of cunning conspiracy against the SNP. I think it was Lord Smith himself who suggested the quoted formula to allow the Commission to get on with the job in hand of strengthening this Parliament. And we all signed it because it is just a statement of fact. What it is not, of course, is a suggestion that the Scottish Government can have as many independence referendums as they like, as often as they like, on whatever pretext occurs to them, and to pretend that it is just nonsense. And indeed, just to note in passing, that what we also discussed and then all signed in the Smith Commission, of course, was the absolutely explicit, deliberate and crystal clear continued reservation of powers over constitutional issues. That's a fact too, albeit a rather inconvenient one for the government's argument, which they're entitled to carry on making, of course. But we're told repeatedly that it is Brexit which changes everything. And I regret what is going to happen on Friday as much as anyone here. That's why I campaigned against Brexit in 2016. But where were the SNP? I can only recall the First Minister occasionally sallying out to attack and undermine the very Remain campaign she purported to be supporting. And famously, the SNP invested less of their resources in that campaign than they do in a single unwinnable by-election. And on the ground, sure.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I think my party is probably guilty of having campaigned less hard in the EU referendum than we might have done. But isn't the fact that it was called just a matter of weeks after our national parliamentary election just one more sign of the level of contempt that the UK continually heaps upon Scotland?
Ian
Well,
Gray.
That is the most pathetic excuse I have ever heard for somebody arguing for failing to campaign and what he 5, 10, 15 an hour ago was arguing was the most important issue facing Scotland at the moment. And what about on the ground? What about on the ground? We managed to get out and campaign, Mr Harvey. On the ground in East Lothian, Labour activists campaigned. Where were the local SNP activists? Nowhere to be seen. Nowhere to be seen. Until the weekend after the referendum, when they suddenly appeared on the high street with European Union flags, finally galvanised by the grievance after the goal was gone. I'll take no lessons from the SNP on being anti-Brexit. And that's why I want this Parliament and this government to focus now on using all of the power that we have, not to double down on the constitutional crisis, to spend another year of independence campaigning, but to redouble our efforts to address the impact of Brexit we've heard about today, to set aside the grievance and face the reality of the challenges the people we represent are facing right now. And the truth is, when it comes to building and deploying the real powers of this real Parliament, the SNP's track record is woeful. We've heard so much today about the claim of right. The SNP refused to sign the claim of right. They refused to sign it, Mr Russell. And then we had the Constitutional Convention. They walked out of that. They walked out of that. And then we had the Calman Commission, which the Parliament, in order to achieve, had to seize power back from the minority SNP government to deliver. An SNP government which came within a hair's breadth of voting against new powers for this Parliament, all the way to that Smith Commission, which led to wide-ranging power over tax and welfare and spending, and which the SNP signed one minute and then denounced the next. Never backward at demanding more powers, the SNP are never to the fore when Scotland's Parliament stands to be strengthened. And where does all this endless revision of history, reinterpretation of agreements, recalibration of referendums, redefinition of election results and mandates, Mr Neil's complete rewriting of the motion before us this afternoon, where does all this get us? It gets us to a day when we hear that health inequalities are worsening, that the map of Scotland's deprivation is ever more sharply focused, that the attainment gap in schools is as wide as ever, and that we are failing every day, even to provide decent housing for our children. It gets us to a day. It gets us to a day when the government strains every sinew to deploy Parliament with all its power over tax and welfare and health and education and the law, not against want or neglect or poverty, or even against the consequences of Brexit, but against our own corporate body, against our own presiding officer, on the symbolic matter of which flag we fly, and against the wishes of most Scots who do not want another independence referendum. To another day of symbolic sound and fury, not much else.
Thank you very much. I now call on Angela Constance to be followed by Jamie Green. Ms Constance, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was Disraeli who said that finality is not the language of politics. And we would do well to remember that democracy is not a one-off event. Politics, like life, irrespective of good times or bad, goes on. And the mandate for Scotland's right to choose has indeed been secured repeatedly. And it is galling to hear a party who have not won an election in Scotland for 60 years behave as if they have a veto. And 2014 was indeed a rare and precious moment to chart a different course. And it did.
It would have been, to coin a phrase, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to avoid being dragged out of Europe against our will. Now, we may not know absolutely everything about the next chapter in the Brexit Buch, but surely we now know enough. The consequences of leaving the EU, the single market and the customs union, only to be replaced with the uncertainty of a free trade agreement and a race to the bottom on human rights, safeguards for workers and environmental protections, is akin to replacing your super-fast broadband with your old dial-up connection. It's a step backwards. And if there was one thing that the Scottish Government and John Major and Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, have in common, is that they all recognise that it will be those with least who will suffer the most as a consequence of Brexit. And there are, of course, real concerns about the supply of food, fuel and medicines. Now, when I look back to the aftermath of the 2014 referendum, and while the Smith Commission didn't, in my view, deliver what was promised, far from it, nonetheless, the pragmatist in me recognised that collectively we took some steps forward. And if you contrast that with events post-2016, with the UK government remaining resolute in their intransigence and not being prepared to come to any compromise with the highest Remain voting part of the UK, with Scotland alone facing an outcome it didn't vote for, what happened to those Conservatives who said what goes for Northern Ireland must go for Scotland? If Brexit has taught us anything, surely it is what not to do if you want to persuade and lead and to bring people together. And this emboldened UK government have not just said no to Scotland's right to choose, but they have indeed said no to all the devolved nations by imposing their withdrawal agreement and trampling over the devolution settlement. The proroguing of the so-called Mother of Parliaments was a new low for parliamentary democracy across the UK. But the all-time low for me was saying no to unaccompanied child refugees, the most vulnerable group of children and young people in the world. And the UK government has also in effect said no to 237,000 EU citizens in Scotland who now have the indignity of applying for the rights that they already have to stay in their own home. The facts of the matter are that without EU migration over the next 25 years, our working age population will fall by 3%, and the negative impact of this is beyond measurement for both our economy and indeed our society and well-being. Devolution over the past 20 years has taken Scotland forward, but we now risk being locked into decline. And I very much wish that we could have a better debate about the indivisible relationship between where power lies and the bread and butter issues that matter to us most. I have never walked away from a debate about what more can and should be done with our existing powers and resources. I steered the child poverty legislation through this Parliament despite not having all the social security powers or employment law. I want to see the right to food enshrined in Scots law, despite the fact that it's the UK government's welfare policies that's driving up demand for food banks. But fewer powers means fewer options, and I really want to see us continue to sweat our powers for more impact. But there will be some issues that trying as best we can with one arm tied behind our back quite simply is not going to be enough, and some of our choices are going to be impossible choices to make. Because for every pound that we spend on making amends for Westminster to stop them dragging people back and making them poorer, we have a pound less to spend on taking people forward and making them richer. So this debate about Scotland's future is inextricably linked to day-to-day life, and the debate has not evaporated, and it cannot be ignored, because to do so is not only unsustainable, it's undemocratic, and it's the utter folly of those who fear that they are on the losing side of an argument and on the losing side of history. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Jamie Green to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Green is the penultimate speaker in the open debate. Mr Green, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start, perhaps surprisingly, by thanking
the Scottish Government for bringing forward today's debate, because they want to talk about Scotland's future. Well, so do I. I want to use our precious parliamentary time, the modest 9 or so hours that this chamber sits per week, to rightfully debate matters of importance to the people that we serve. Because surely that is what is expected of us all. Absolutely. And I'd like to think that whatever the politics in this room or the constitutional views therein, this chamber should be a place of free debate. This place should be where opposition members, and dare I say even government backbenchers, are free to hold ministers of the government of the day to account, day in, day out, for their actions and for their inactions. So if the Scottish Government comes here and calls a debate about Scotland's future, Presiding Officer, I'm all ears. But Scotland's future lies in how this Parliament, its parties and its government uses both its time and its responsibility to deliver on devolution for the good of the people that we represent. And we should represent all of our constituents. We've spent 40 minutes today in a debate about how we overturn the independent decision-making of this Parliament's independent corporate body. And now we're spending 2.5 hours on the Constitution. So let me say to people in the gallery who are watching this at home, we can do so much better than this. What does this debate tell people about the priorities of this government? Now, those heckling amongst them, I know there are SNP members in this chamber who have worked in our NHS, who taught in our schools, who fought for our country, and who have dedicated their lives to public service. There are many in here that I have great respect for, as I've got to know them over the last 4 years. But surely even they must be nervous about the imagery of this Parliament prioritising flags, the Constitution and referenda over schools, hospitals and police stations. First Minister, you want to talk about Scotland's future, so let's talk about Scotland's future, because Scotland's future is as precious to me as it is to my mother, my neighbours, my friends, those of political persuasion and those of none, just as being Scottish is precious to me, despite what some might say. Today's motion talks about forming a government that is best suited to Scotland's needs. The question is, therefore, does the track record of this government fulfil that ambition? Let's talk instead today about the fact that violent crime has risen by 18% in Inverclyde last year. But we're told there's nothing to see. Let's talk about subject choice reduction in our schools, teacher shortages in STEM, students in Scotland being squeezed out of university, and all the while we are accused of a moan fest. Let's talk about the new hospital on the East Coast, which still isn't open, and the one on the West Coast, which is, but is under investigation. Let's talk about the 2 new ferries promised to our island communities, but are lying half-built on the dock while our island communities suffer. Because, Presiding Officer, Scotland's future doesn't lie in constitutional debate. It doesn't lie buried deep in the white papers of independence. It lies in improving opportunities and outcomes for everybody in Scotland. Scotland's future lies in tackling GP shortages and waiting times in our hospital. Scotland's future lies in delivering affordable, reliable public transport which meets the needs of all our communities and the environment. Just as Scotland's future lies in ensuring that there are enough teachers so we can address the significant growth in multi-level teaching and give our children the education that they deserve. Scotland's future lies in looking after our police officers, in tackling violent crime, in reducing drug deaths and making our streets safer. Scotland's future lies in growing our economy so that towns like my hometown, Mr Mackay, in Greenock, isn't ranked top of the deprivation table. Housing, health, education, all major factors in that depressing accolade that it has inherited. And that is a sad indictment of your government. That's what happens when government takes its eye off the ball, Presiding Officer. Because the truth is, as you can hear, when the going gets tough, deflect. Because that's what today really is about. Nothing more than sheer, unashamed deflection. Deflection from debating the very things that devolution has empowered us with. Presiding Officer, the sad but inevitable truth at the heart of this debate is that I often wonder if the SNP government really cares whether or not devolution succeeds or fails. Because either outcome, through its misguided logic, will give credence to the notion that independence is somehow the answer to all of our woes. So when I say to the First Minister, get on with the day job, I say that not just to the First Minister, but to a challenge to each and every one of us. This isn't about sovereignty, this is about duty. And our duty is to ensure that excellence prevails in every health board, in every local authority, in every place of education. Because if we don't, we are all failing in our duty. Presiding Officer, Scotland's future is already in our hands. And the sooner we realise that, the sooner we can all get back to the day job.
Thank you very much. And I call Stuart McMillan, the last speaker in the open debate. Then we move to closing speeches. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, actually, I just want to touch upon 2 points that Mr Green just spoke about. Mr Green, the Constitution matters. If it didn't, then we wouldn't be leaving the European Union on Friday evening. And secondly, on the point regarding flags, I suggest that Mr Green go online and look at some of the images of London at the moment, festooned with Union flags, as compared to just the debate about one flag outside of this building. Now, today's debate has been very much of what I expected, certainly robust defence of independence from those who are pro-independence, and also those from the pro-union side, a robust defence of their particular position. But one thing is certain, though, and that's it's the status of Scotland and its position in the EU come 11 p.m. on Friday evening. I am an English-born Scot. I'm also a European, and my circumstances change on Friday night. And for me, this material change of circumstance necessitates that this Parliament should take forward a referendum on independence. In 2014, we were told to lead the UK, not leave it. We were love-bombed by many, and the political class from Westminster were sent up to tell us to stay. However, since then, the Respect agenda has ended, and the Westminster elite shut their ears to the concerns and the suggestions of the devolved parliaments and assemblies in the UK. The fact that the 3 devolved lawmaking bodies voted against the UK government's withdrawal agreement, refusing to grant its consent, tells a story. Now, to add to this situation is the fact that England and Wales, they get their wish to leave the European Union. Northern Ireland gets a better deal, and Scotland gets nothing. Now, Presiding Officer, one of the words that we have heard certainly over many, many months, particularly from the Tories and certainly from the Lib Dems today, is the word divisive. Now, I would actually go further than them. Within any multi-party democracy, there are divisions. Clearly, it has to be the case, because you get different political parties, get different views, different thoughts and different policies. And also, in this Parliament, we divide at 5 p.m. every single night when this chamber sits. The political debate, by its nature, will create some element of division. And every 5 years, with elections, the population divide as they vote for the parties they wish to vote for. So the aspect of division that some from the pro-union side actually want to highlight is just an absolute nonsense. Now, the Tories, they did not want this Parliament, as Alex Neil spoke about earlier. The Lib Dems, they seem to want federalism, and Labour seem to want home rule. Now, we know very clearly about the Tories' position, but on the other 2, they are as clear as mud. Now, last week, in the Culture, Tourism Europe and External Affairs Committee, we heard the unfortunate truth for the Tories. Professor Anand Menon stated, and I quote, "On ratification, I absolutely agree with what Dr. Fabian Zulig said about the European Parliament. And bear it in mind that if we end up with a mixed agreement, this is regarding the trade agreement, that needs approved by parliaments across Europe, what is curious about this negotiation is that it is the only negotiation in history whose specific objective is to make trade more difficult." So, Presiding Officer, pro-Europeans are being dragged out of the European Union against our will on Friday evening. There will be a trade deal, if one can be done, that will make the economy in Scotland worse off. Now, here will be another material change of circumstance to our country and to the people who live in Scotland. In 2013, the UK government reiterated that the people of Scotland have a right to decide on our future. And, Presiding Officer, every party signed up to the Smith Commission's proposals, nothing in this report prevents Scotland becoming an independent country in the future, should the people of Scotland choose. And last week, the Survation poll indicated that 61% of those asked backed this Parliament deciding on whether to hold an independence referendum. Now, okay?
Mike Rumbles.
I understand thoroughly what you're saying about the opinion poll, but I said to the First Minister, just 1 month ago, 55% of voters. Why do you object to this? It's a simple fact. 55% of voters in Scotland voted for candidates who don't want another. There is no real demand.
Stuart McMillan.
Mr Rumbles, elections and referenda are two totally different forms of public engagement. Two totally different forms. I want independence for many, many reasons, but fundamentally I want the lot of every single person in my constituency in Scotland to actually improve. Now, my constituency has never fully recovered from the systematic deindustrialisation strategy of the Tories from 1979. And the SIMD data published yesterday was sobering reading. Now, this tells me that the austerity agenda from Westminster is not working. And this tells me that things need to change to grow and strengthen communities. It also tells me that the full powers of independence actually ensures that my constituency and others like it will improve, and it will. Now, over Christmas, Presiding Officer, Scotland lost one of our greatest writers, Alistair Gray. Alistair Gray famously wrote about working, and I quote, "as if you live in the early days of a better nation." This is what independence will bring, and why I will be voting for Scotland tonight at 5 o'clock, and also why I want my constituency to be better, and I want the lot of every single person living in my constituency to be better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr McMillan. Closing speeches, I call on Alec Cole-Hamilton to close for the Liberal Democrats. A firm 6 minutes, Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It gives me great privilege to close for my party this afternoon. This feels very different to debates of this kind that have happened in this parliamentary session. Presiding Officer, I invite you to look around you. The public gallery is largely empty. It's been largely empty for most of the day. The press gallery is largely empty, with the honourable exception of Liam Kirkcaldy, who is one of the finest comedy sketch writers in Scotland. He is not writing the front page splash of tomorrow's papers. It is symptomatic, Deputy Presiding Officer, of public interest on the wane. And I fear that Jackson Carlo is right, that this afternoon we have been playing only to the hardcore of the Yes movement, each of them dutifully tuned into Parliament TV and occasionally looking up from the crossword on the back of the National. Our country has judged this afternoon's debate for the theatre that it is, and it has turned away and moved on to other things. Presiding Officer, it is high time that this Parliament joined them. At the start of her speech, the First Minister suggested that opposition politicians such as myself would speak with faux outrage. Can I assure her that my outrage is quite real? Outrage that another afternoon of government time we are spending not debating the many crises in our public services that her administration has provided on. Outrage that once again this First Minister is misappropriating my vote to remain in the European Union as a catalyst for another divisive independence referendum. And outrage that she is falsely once again trying to characterise this debate as an unambiguous choice between two unions. Since the Brexit result of 2016, she has sought to capitalise on the grief response of many ardent Remainers. I know what that grief response feels like. She has sought to characterise independence as a bridge back to membership of the European Union. But as with so many arguments deployed by this government, it fails to withstand exposure to reality. She knows that membership of the single market, as an independent Scotland would have to join, would mean hard border checks at Carlisle, that the treaty of the functioning of the European Union requires accession states to have a deficit, a structural deficit of no higher than 3% when ours is 7%. Put simply, Presiding Officer, the EU may choose not to have us for years.
Excuse me a minute, Mr Cole-Hamilton, please just sit down. There's too much chuntering going on. I can't hear what's being said. You go ahead, please.
The European Union may choose not to have us for years and only off the back of savage spending cuts and tax rises. The measure of the SNP commitment to the European Union is hollow as well, and that is evidence in the reality, as Willie Rennie said, that they spent far more on the Shetland by-election than they did on the Remain campaign in Scotland, that they refused to back a people's vote for 2.5 years, and that a third of their supporters that they will require to deliver the independence that they crave, still voted for Brexit. I say this to the First Minister, Remain voters will find you out. Presiding Officer, as a Liberal Democrat, I know something about losing elections, but Brexit absolutely devastated me. I believe it made Britain smaller as a country, and it worried those many European Union citizens who work and live amongst us. And at this point, I echo the words of Jenny Gilruth. You are welcome here. This is your home, and we want you to stay. Presiding Officer, to my fingertips, I'm an internationalist. But the last thing I could do is to meet the loss of one union I care about by jettisoning the other union I care about. Brexit is not a catalyst for independence, but a warning against it. Presiding Officer, Donald Cameron, I think, in an excellent speech, put his finger on it, that we have learned absolutely nothing from the government this afternoon. This afternoon, indeed, was designed, as I think Richard Leonard rightly said, to appease her over-agitated base. Because, Presiding Officer, there is a point every few months when the launch of a new fact-checking service, which doesn't check any facts, or 10,000 dinner conversations, which the National are asking people to have. Not at my house, they won't. She knows that that just won't cut it anymore. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. She knows, the First Minister knows that she has to keep her base marching, that without meaningless debates like these in Parliament, then the eyes of her base will begin to drift to the failures of this government. And, Presiding Officer, those failures are legion. Legally binding waiting time guarantees being broken every single week, tens of thousands of times, people in pain coming into our surgeries, clutching letters saying they'll be treated in 12 weeks when they haven't been seen in 50. Child mental health waiting times, which see people in my constituency, children in your constituency, waiting up to 2 years for first-line treatment. Police officers off work with stress, or when they are at work, forced to inhabit stations that are structurally unsound. A children's hospital lying empty, costing £1.4 million a month, and primary schools filled with talented teachers in overcrowded classes teaching to a test that none of them agree with. The list goes on and on and on. Presiding Officer, we have heard a lot about mandates today, but at no point have the combined manifestos of either of the parties that support independence in this country ever amounted to 50% when they have proposed an independence referendum in their pages. Furthermore, neither of the parties who will vote for this motion tonight have met the test of public opinion that they set themselves, and so we shall vote against it tonight.
Thank you very much. I call on Alec Rowley to close for Labour. Again, a firm 6 minutes, Mr Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In speaking in this debate today, I want to make clear that I very much recognise the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government that is best suited to their needs. And that is the position of the Labour Party, and that is why we've brought forward the amendment today that says that. I recognise that during the 2014 referendum, and I have recognised it in debates since, and I recognise it now. I also do not disagree with the motion brought forward by the First Minister today when it recognises that nothing in the Smith Commission report prevents Scotland from becoming an independent country in the future should the people of Scotland so choose. That's just a matter of fact. I also agree that there has been a material change in circumstances since 2014. However, there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the material change to the UK, namely Brexit, has resulted in any material change in public opinion towards either independence or indeed the desire to have another independence referendum. The 2014 vote was 45-55, and 6 years on, all the evidence suggests that there has been little movement either way, so the country remains absolutely divided on this question. That said, poll after poll has demonstrated that there is no majority right now demanding another referendum. They are more concerned, I would suggest, about the impact of Brexit and what that will mean for Scotland and for the people of Scotland. Now, I hear people saying, what about the general election result? Is that not a mandate? I would refer to Professor Sir John Curtis and his recent blog where he outlined 2 polls that took place during that election campaign that specifically asked the people's view on whether or not they supported or opposed holding another referendum during this year, this next year. Ipsos Murray found that 42% supported the idea and 50% opposed. Panel-based found that 38% supported the idea of another referendum in this year, with 51% opposed. This led Professor Curtis to say, and I quote, "On the basis of this evidence, it is difficult to argue that there is clear majority support for holding a referendum on the timescales proposed by the Scottish Government." So, yeah.
Alec Neil.
Can I thank the member for taking an intervention? The argument that we put forward is an argument about the timing of the referendum, and the resolution says the Parliament would determine the timing of the referendum, and therefore Labour would obviously vote accordingly at that time. But does he not agree with all the other principles laid out in the motion? What other principles in the motion does he disagree with?
Alec Rowley.
I mean, my reading of the motion is that the Scottish Government are calling for a referendum in 2020. We have been absolutely clear that we absolutely respect the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future. But what I've just set out there demonstrates that right now there is no majority in Scotland calling for an independence referendum. And I can understand that because people are genuinely and sincerely worried about what the impact of Brexit is going to be, whether we will, because there is still a serious risk that we could crash out without a deal by the end of this year. And so what we're saying is that, yes, we respect the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future, but right now we respect the fact that there is no majority in Scotland right now demanding a second independence referendum. And you've got to ask yourself, therefore, who is the First Minister representing with this motion here today? I would suggest that is a minority within Scotland at this current time, deciding that the best course of action amidst this period of great political, constitutional and economic upheaval to hold another independence referendum is, in my view, simply ill-conceived. It is also disingenuous to the people of Scotland, for a clear picture of what they would be voting for cannot be presented to them, no matter what Mike Russell says, because we would not know what we were voting for until the dust on Brexit settles. We will not know what the impact has been on Scotland, the UK and indeed the rest of Europe. It is essential that the negative consequences of Brexit are properly dealt with and mitigated before any clear proposals come forward. But on the question of mitigation, I have to say that those that are most disingenuous in this chamber today are the members of the Tory party and the Liberal Party on those benches opposite, because the hypocrisy of their amendments is to identify education, health and all these other public services when it's absolutely clear that the main factor in the poor public services in this country over the last few years has been failed Tory austerity. Failed Tory austerity that was introduced when the coalition came into place. The mitigation of £100 million for the bedroom tax, an abhorrent tax that was introduced by Smiling Willie Rennie's party and the Tory party, that £100 million, if it was not being used to mitigate welfare cuts, would be ploughed into our schools and elsewhere. So I would conclude, Presiding Officer, by saying this. Labour supports the democratic right of the Scottish people to determine their own future, and we will continue to do so. But right now there is no demand for another referendum. The parties, the progressive parties that want to see us tackle the issues and want to see the powers in this Parliament to tackle the big issues should work together, come together and work on an agenda for greater powers for this Parliament to address the issues of Scotland.
Thank you. I call on Adam Tompkins to close the Conservatives. Mr Tompkins, again, a strict 6 minutes.
Time is precious, Presiding Officer, and limited. And yet the problems facing the Scottish Government are mounting, many of them problems of their own making. This debate is entitled Scotland's Future. Scotland's future depends on addressing the problems faced by the Scottish Government and by sorting them out. Our underperforming economy, our struggling health service, and the appalling mismanagement of our schools. But the SNP don't want to talk about any of these issues, Presiding Officer. We wanted a statement this week on what the SNP proposes to do about the disastrous and crumbling state of Scotland's police stations. But we were told there wasn't time. There wasn't time, Presiding Officer, because the SNP wanted to hold a debate about flags. This has been a dismal day, Presiding Officer, for the Parliament over which you and your colleagues preside. We all know that the priorities of the Scottish people are that Scotland's politics should be resolutely focused on schools, on hospitals, on skills, jobs and the economy. And yet our time, precious and limited though it is, has been devoted to debates on flags and the SNP's pet obsession with independence. Now, I do want to talk about Scotland's future. Let's talk about the future of Scotland's economy and what the SNP's and about the SNP's long record of economic failure. In breach of clear manifesto promises, the SNP has raised income tax for more than 1 million Scots, making Scotland the highest taxed part of the UK. This hasn't increased revenues at all, because at the same time, the SNP has failed to grow the tax base. The Scottish economy is growing at less than half the rate of the UK's economy. Scotland has slower business growth. The employment rate in Scotland is lower. Foreign direct investment is down. Business investment in Scotland is down. And on top of all of this, we have the ruinous car park tax to look forward to. Scotland's future, Presiding Officer, requires that we have a government determined to address these economic failures, whereas all we have here is a tired government running from its record to force on us debates on flags and independence. Presiding Officer, I want to talk about Scotland's future. Let's talk about the future of Scotland's schools and about the long record of SNP failure in education. An attainment gap that is widening, not narrowing. Overall attainment declining, not improving. Pupils already struggling, suffering more than brighter pupils are. SNP policy on closing the attainment gap failing, having no material impact. Subject choice in Scottish schools squeezed. Multi-level teaching on the rise, leading to particular problems in science subjects. No wonder then that on Mr Swinney's watch, in the international PISA scores, science in Scotland stands at a record low. Maths, likewise, at a record low. And reading, about Mr Swinney likes to brag so much, just about average. Scotland's future, Presiding Officer, depends on the success of Scottish schools and of the Scottish education system generally. This is all devolved. This is all the responsibility of SNP Scottish ministers. But again, they don't want to talk about any of it. They want to hide behind a flag and bang the drum for independence. Scotland's future, Presiding Officer, Scotland's future needs a healthy population supported and nurtured by a world-class, fit-for-purpose 21st century health service. So how are the SNP doing on this front, apart from the serial health boards taken into special measures and hospitals that cannot even open their doors? The 12-week treatment time guarantee never once met. We have urgent cancer patients waiting more than 2 months for treatment. We have the highest number of drug deaths ever recorded, the worst in Europe. We have nearly 500 consultant vacancies, an increasing lack of nurses and midwives, and high levels of mental health vacancies. The NHS in Scotland has been persistently underfunded and mismanaged by this SNP. That's the issue affecting Scotland's future that I'd like to see the Scottish Government focus on and the Scottish Parliament debate. Now, Presiding Officer, I believe in the sovereign right of the Scottish people. I believe it was exercised in September 2014 when more than 2 million of our fellow Scots voted to reject independence. And rather like this afternoon's debate, that independence referendum was rancorous and divisive. But let me end, Presiding Officer, on a point of consensus, because there is something the First Minister said with which I agree. She said it in September 2013. The SNP, she said, have always said that in our view, these kind of referendums are once-in-a-generation events. This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for people in Scotland, she said. It wasn't once in a generation, Presiding Officer. In her own words, it was once in a lifetime. And in that referendum, the people of Scotland exercised their sovereignty to say no, and the people of Scotland meant it.
Thank you. And can I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, to wind up our debate?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let us start from a fact. This debate is taking place because in 2 days' time, Scotland will be taken out of the EU against our will, and everybody here who has a passport that says they are a EU citizen will lose that designation. That is something we do not want to happen, and this government has fought against it happening. But we are very fortunate in Scotland because we have the opportunity to move on from that back into membership of the EU. And we know from polls that most people in Scotland want to be within the EU. So this is a debate about the potential that Scotland has to move away from Brexit, which has been imposed upon us, and to move towards the normality of a small nation in Europe. But the debate, of course, has also been about the record of the Scottish Government, and so it should be. And I think that Jackson Carlaw, and I want to make this point, should be concerned about government failure. Jackson Carlaw should be concerned about the failure of a government that's been in power for a long time and has failed to deliver over that period. He should be concerned about that, but the trouble is he's focused on the wrong government. Because there is another government which we need to look at in these matters, a government which tries to exercise its control and does exercise substantial budgetary control over what we do. All you have to do is to start a Google search to look at the record of the UK government. For example, let us look at some of the headlines over the past few weeks and months. Doomed hospital costs set to soar to staggering £1.1 billion. The Royal Liverpool Hospital, which is unfinished, like the Birmingham Midland Hospital. That, I think, I notice, as ever, I notice that Labour, excuse me, Presiding Officer, I am not taking any interventions from Mr Finlay, which I have to say is likely to improve the quality of this debate significantly. 1 in 8 secondary schools in England are failing. Commuters, here's a headline, are heading into their 3rd week of train chaos as a new timetable is implemented. The Prime Minister, when he wrote to the First Minister some weeks ago, used a word about the Scottish economy stagnating. This is from the Financial Times. Economic conditions remain stagnant in the 2nd quarter amid relentless Brexit uncertainty. The stagnation is in the UK economy. Let's touch on the health service. 1/5 of patients miss NHS targets. Go back to education. Examiners left horrified by flaws in English GCSE marking. What about housing? England needs to build 4 million new homes to deal with an escalating crisis. They don't like it. They don't like it. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, I don't care whether they like it or not, because it is the truth.
Order. Can we hear the Cabinet Secretary, please?
The crime rate in the rest of the UK is much worse. Rural payments are worse. The UK food industry threatened to stop cooperating with UK government because of the catastrophic impact of Brexit. English councils are braced for the biggest government cuts since 2010. Mr Fraser was particularly excited about the police and about police stations. At least there are police stations in Scotland. 600 police stations have closed since 2010. 600. Mr Fraser, presiding officer, I'm going to continue.
Members are allowed to react. Would members please keep the noise down? We cannot hear the Cabinet Secretary's comments. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Fraser was concerned about the overspend on ferries. Has he seen the defence overspend? 1.3 billion on the frigates. I know they don't like it, but the reality of this is that in every area of government business, there is a deflection going on here. It is a deflection. It is a deflection, presiding officer. It is a deflection from their failures, trying to pretend that in some way they are somebody else's. They are deflecting from their own abysmal record, supported by the Liberal Democrats. No, pure deflection. Because, presiding officer, let me just touch on just some of the things. Let me just touch on some of the things.
One second, Cabinet Secretary. Yes. Thank you, Mr Rumbles. That was a very good point of order. It's the very point that I'm considering myself. It is simply too noisy. Now, I can hear the Cabinet Secretary has slightly lost his voice, and I would please urge all members to keep their comments to themselves. Keep them to after.
Presiding
if you wish
officer,
to speak, stand up and give an intervention.
Presiding officer, there is a list of things which I could and should read out of what this government has been doing even in the last 7 days. But let me just touch on some of them. The export statistics, which Mr Mackay released this morning, show a 1.1 billion increase in international exports, and the GDP statistics show Scotland's economy grew by 0.3% during the third quarter. We have launched a wide-ranging research project to understand the needs of students. There's been a major report, even today, on deer management. We have launched our payment programme to provide financial security for farmers. We've announced a new climate change group. We have published the latest update of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. We've welcomed the Scottish Funding Council's budget round. We have been working in every area of national life and continue to do so. Are we perfect? Not even the First Minister is perfect. I'm sorry to say that. But we are delivering as a government. And we are delivering as a government, and the people who are failing and who have a constitutional obsession are the ones sitting there. Because they are the people who are taking us out of Europe. Admittedly, their constitutional obsession is not as great as Willie Rennie's. Willie Rennie's Save Fife from Freedom campaign is now an absolute obsession. But it is the Tories who are taking us out of the EU. It is the Tories who are spending every single moment of legislative time on Brexit, every single penny on Brexit, every single political issue is about Brexit. And that is the problem. The problem we have in Scotland is a Tory government that is taking us out of Europe. And how do we resolve that problem, presiding officer? By voting for independence. Independence isn't peripheral. A choice in Scotland is not peripheral. The choice is central. And that's why this debate is important. Because if this chamber this evening votes in favour of a referendum, then that must happen. We have parties in this chamber who say that all the time. But if this chamber votes by the majority for a referendum, it must happen. And it is, I think, bizarre to see any party in this chamber arguing the opposite. The Lib Dems, who are meant to be the champions of proportional representation, have said this afternoon that it does not matter how this chamber votes, they will still not recognise the wish of the Scottish people. That's not liberal, that's not democratic. Presiding officer, just over a century ago in Cork, in January 1885, Parnell said something that needs to be borne in mind. No man has a right to fix the boundaries of the march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, "This far shalt thou go, and no further." No man. Certainly not Willie Rennie. Absolutely not Richard Leonard. Not Jackson Carlaw. And absolutely not Boris Johnson. If this Parliament votes for a referendum, it will have it.
Thank you. That concludes our debate on Scotland's future. We'll move on to the next item of business, which is... Oh, sorry. Point of order, Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It seems that there's some indication that the First Minister's going to make announcements on Friday on the way forward, depending on the vote this evening, which I think we can all guess what that's going to be. Would it not be more respectful to this Parliament for the First Minister to actually outline her position in Parliament rather than out with?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, there is an expectation that the government's business will be announced to the Parliament before it's announced to the general public. We don't know what the announcement will be on Friday, but we've had a debate today on that subject, which I believe will include the content. We're going to move on now to the point of order, Rhoda Grant. Sorry, point of order, Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last Thursday, I took part in the debate on air traffic control centralisation at Highlands and Islands airports. During that debate, I made the point that airports at Benbecula and Wick were being downgraded without consultation with staff. Gail Ross intervened on me at that point and stated there had been consultation with staff at Wick Airport. I've since been copied into an email from an air traffic controller at Wick Airport. It reads, "I watched today the parliamentary debate on centralisation plans at High Isle, and to my astonishment, during Rhoda Grant's speech, Gail Ross interrupted her to state that staff at Wick had been involved in consultation about the proposed downgrade of the unit. Firstly, as you are well aware, no such consultation has taken place, and I would expect someone from ATMS team to correct MSP Gail Ross to such facts before any further damage can be done to Wick. Presiding Officer, perhaps Gail Ross would like to take the opportunity to amend the record, apologise for misrepresenting her constituents and join me to save these vital jobs.
Can I thank Rhoda Grant for giving me advance notice that she intended to raise a point of order. This is not a point for me to rule on as chair. The procedure, however, for members is that all members have a procedure in place if they wish to correct the report concerning comments they made themselves. The member has drawn Ms Ross's attention to the point, and it is up to the member to then make a decision. Now, moving on to the next item of business. It's consideration of Business Motion 20644 in the name of Graham Day. On behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, could I call on Graham Day to move this motion? Graham Day.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Day. And no member has asked to speak on this motion. I therefore put the question that motion 20644 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The next item is consideration of business motions 20636 and 20637 on the stage 1 timetables for 2 bills and 20638 and 20639 on the stage 2 timetables for 2 bills. Could I call on Graham Day to move these 4 motions?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And again, no one has indicated they wish to speak. Therefore, the question is that motions 20636 to 20639 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. We turn now to decision time. The first question this evening is that Amendment 20625.2 in the name of Liz Smith, which seeks to amend motion 20625 in the name of Fiona Hislop on recognising Scotland in Europe, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20625.2 in the name of Liz Smith is yes 54, no 63. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 20625.1 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Fiona Hislop on recognising Scotland and Europe be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20625.1 in the name of Claire Baker is yes 54, no 63. There is one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 20625 in the name of Fiona Hislop on recognising Scotland and Europe be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20625 in the name of Fiona Hislop is yes 63, no 54. There was one abstention. The motion is therefore agreed. Now, the Parliament has resolved to direct the SPCB to continue to fly the European flag daily from Holyrood, and I can confirm that the SPCB will amend its flag flying policy with immediate effect. I can remind members as we move to the next vote that if the amendment in the name of Jackson Carlow is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Richard Leonard and Willie Rennie will fall. So the question is that amendment 20615.1 in the name of Jackson Carlow, which seeks to amend motion 20615 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on Scotland's future be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20615.1 in the name of Jackson Carlow is yes 27, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 20615.3 in the name of Richard Leonard, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Nicola Sturgeon be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20615.3 in the name of Richard Leonard is yes 22, no 96. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that the amendment 20615.2 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, be agreed. Are we agreed? No. Or not agreed? We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20615.2 in the name of Willie Rennie is yes 52, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And our final question is that motion 20615 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on Scotland's future be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. Vote on motion 20615 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is yes 64, no 54. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. Thank you. That concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of David Stewart on right to full care to die at home. We'll just take a short pause while members and ministers change seats. Short pause.